Thank you everyone for being with us today. I'm very happy to start our first Scholars of Excellence workshop for the calendar year, not the first for the academic year, but the first for the calendar year. And happy 2024 to all of us. So I'm delighted to chair this workshop, which actually finds its origins in Marcela Tapia Latina's visit and stay with us as a Scholar of Excellence, and also actually Omar Lujan's and Harm Bowder's partnership project, Solicity. I don't remember the full title, but Solicity, like solidarity, sanctuary cities that are providing solidarity to people without status. And then we are delighted also to generally strengthen our connection with the Americas and with the Spanish speaking literature of this topic. Before, however, I get into the actual presentation of our workshop, let me start with a land acknowledgement. We're gathering today in Toronto. That is the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississauga tribes. And it is also the dish with one spoon territory, and the dish with one spoon means the dish are the resources of this land, and we all have one spoon, and we're invited to share in peace and in solidarity. And I think this is very important, both in times of very, very ugly times this year, 2023 year, in terms of war and destruction around the world and persecution, but also in relation to more kind of long-term challenges that we're facing, like climate change. And I think Indigenous knowledge teaches us a lot about how to respect the land and how to cherish it and keep it for the next generation, not just for us. And with that, I'd like to, again, start this workshop, which is on the Venezuelan pathways in Latin America and the Caribbean. And some of you, whether online or in person, might have followed our previous workshop in late November that was also in on this region. And I think this is a region that actually perhaps, again, in the unfortunate situation of destruction and war elsewhere, hasn't attracted sufficient attention, particularly in Canada, but the Venezuelan crisis has been going on now for over 6 years, and it's actually probably in terms of numbers the highest displacement crisis right now in the world, highest than Syria and other cases, and also one that I should say has been quite smoothly addressed within South and Central America. And actually in Canada, for instance, we know also from work that Bertie Olinto has done and presented here this past year, we don't have actually many Venezuelans arriving. And that is why we thought with Shiva Mohan that we needed to find out more about what happens in Latin America and the Caribbean. The Caribbean, I know Shiva is preparing also his book on that. Is again an area that was not given sufficient attention so far in terms of the Venezuelan displacement. So I think without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Shiva to say a few words about the workshop. Although he's also a paper presenter. I'm very happy to have Henry Parada, who is a professor of social work at CMU and an expert of Latin America here with us, although Henry works mostly on refugee children, but his expertise, I think, spans the region more broadly. And as a co-chair, Omar Lujan, who is a research fellow and coordinator of the Solicity project. Some practical issues. So Omar is keeping an eye on the Zoom chat. So this is for our online participants. Please write your comments and questions in the chat, and Omar will pick them up while Henry will be moderating the discussion in the room. I know we have one practical thing to say, which is that the washrooms are outside this office, and there is a code you can see it at the entrance. I don't know, Jessica, if I'm forgetting any other practical issue. You can all speak. We don't need a microphone because there is a mic there, so you can all speak freely, whether speakers or discussants or people who have questions, and we look forward to a very lively discussion and for a very interesting paper. Thanks
so much, Anna, and thank you all for coming out in a very cold Canadian outside today. But I just want to say it's a privilege to co-convene this session with And this being the first Scholars of Excellence workshop for this term, the first of more to come, including our migration working groups. I thought it was important to gather people from different geographies to give their perspectives and share their expertise and insights on what is happening in their context in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I emphasize the Caribbean because for a lot of the conversation on migration, the Caribbean, this umbrella term Latin America, oftentimes subsumes the Caribbean and is forgotten in a kind of way. So when we were titling this workshop, I emphasized that we need to add the Caribbean. Although it's on the end, it's still included.
Latin America and Caribbean.
Latin America and the Caribbean. Because the Venezuelan migration crisis, this situation, although it's carried in the mainstream media, the CNNs, the BBCs, the City News, etc., all capture what's happening in South America and Central America. It's also having impacts on island nations next door. And so I'm happy that we have Natalie on our panel from Jamaica to give us insights, and of course, our colleagues of Scholar of Excellence. So with that, I'll just hand it over to Henry.
What am I supposed to do? You two, that's what is actually said. Welcome, everybody. I'm really happy to be invited to this fantastic and mesmerizing presentation. I hope you had the chance to see our colleagues' biography. I'm not going to read it. As Anna said, I will be trying to have the conversation, guide the conversation here. And Omar is going to be talking to the colleagues online. So we have 4 presentations, as you may remember. Can you keep your questions to the end so we have a lively conversation at the end already? If you had the chance to review the articles, I'm sure you will have a lot of questions just by reading that. I have a lot of questions. Okay, so without much ado, Marcela Tapia Ladino is our first speaker, and the title of the topic is Colchane and Iquique in Times of Pandemic, from the margin to the center of the Venezuela humanitarian crisis, 2022. Oh, you need, okay, yeah. Can you see it?
First, I want to thank sir. My English is not so good. I prefer to read in this moment for my sorry. Well, the first I want to thank sir for the invitation to be with today and share this moment. And especially want to thank Anna for the invitation, and Maggie, Marisa, Shiva, and Omar for giving me and helping me get here. For me, it's an honor to be here today. Well, what I'm going to present today are the result of 2 funded research projects, one directed by Carolina Stefani, and another that recently closed for me. Before the pandemic, events were recorded at hardened borders. For example, the 11S, which marked a milestone in terms of hardening borders and creating new ones. During the pandemic, one the measure to control the expansion of COVID-19 was border closure. Do you remember? Well, Ramonet called the pandemic a total social fact because affected all areas of life, public and private. Pandemics are imbued with border policies. Yes, correct. No problem. This. From 1818 to 2020, border studies have moved from the discussion of the border as a limit to a production that focuses on the interaction and social production of borders, as well as control and security devices. The pandemic has reinforced the separation, sovereign, national, and state-centered nature of national border. The place is this study was Colchane. Colchane is side Chilean side, and Pisiga Bolívar is Bolivian side. This space is Colchane was created with geologic purpose. This is a photo. And Chile and Bolivia have not had diplomatic relations since 1978. And currently, an entry and exit point for people and merchandise is a main border crossing for Bolivian merchants and workers, and the main entry and exit point for merchandise. In the pandemic, it was the main land entry point for Venezuelan migration. Border area or space are different units of analysis that for us to overcome the divides that remain on the line that divides to different mutually exclusive space. This is the Sassen text. Combine them is still entry that require its own empirical and theoretical specification. This photo is the Pisiga Bolívar is signed Bolivia. Well, the space is for all a new cross-border internships. Is an ancestral territory, but is the mayor of Colchane say the border divides, but is a space understood with traditional approach, and it is a space of constant crossing and cross-border social practice. Well, do you know the Venezuela? And it's estimated that 7.771 million Venezuelans have immigration from 2003 to present. The route for non-stable step, what has been called the Western Corridor. Colchane is a highland town located on the edge of border of Chile and Bolivia for over 3,650 meters above sea level. It has a high altitude desert climb characterized by a strong thermal oscillation between day and night and strong daytime solar radiation. People also circulate there, generally inhabited of the territory to trade, work, specter, visit family and friends, and stock up on essential products among the town located on the border. This is the, no, is correct? This is a customer, and this is the point to cross the formal fashion, and this is the no paso no habilitado, se me olvida. Paso no habilitado.
Not, yeah, forbidden step, or
Yes.
something like that.
In this place are too many similar groups, no formal, more 100. This is estimate. Okay. This is Pisiga Bolivar. This is the name is between Chile and Bolivia. And this place, the name is Pisiga too, but is Chilean flag. And this is Colchane, 1 kilometer the border. The border crossing is a closing point, but on the side, local people cross daily. Aymara community was divided by international bordering. In this space, there are more than 100 states that are not enabled. During the pandemic, the border was militarized with the Colchane plan, and a state of emergency was declared. Iquique is a tourist city located on the Pacific coast and 237 kilometers away. It's one of the main tourist destinations in Chile and northern Argentina. The majority of Venezuelans arrived impoverished in Chile. So once they left their care homes, they were left homeless because they didn't have resources for hotel or rent. That is why they stayed in a square or beaches on the city, waiting to raise money to continue on their way to Santiago and the city in the south. The improvised camp in Brazil Square, this is a photo, was embedded on September 24, 2021. In this moment on the news, on the radio, and on the paper, we feel revival of nationalism, strong centralized marginality and marginalization of the territory. There was no plan to solve the homeless situation of migrants. Many civil society organizations and churches come out to help people. The first official migrant camp was stepped up in October 2021 as a part of a right of the OEM and a UNHCR platform. At the beginning of 2021, the Chilean police built the first shelter with its own resource in Channel. This is a date, but what is important fact for the other students too. New anti-immigrant march and stop of the region by truck driver. In February, the government established a state of emergency and depended the reach of the border limit. In March 22, new government is moment to Gabriel Boric. Well, before the pandemic, border control and restriction on crossing border politic of hostility were tightened and rise of nationalism populism partly explain this process. The pandemic used the closure of national borders as tool to protect territory and prevent. This increases the sense of threat to those who move the need to protect the border. And this text, borders are clear back in a way that might have seemed unlikely before the COVID. Thank you, and this. Sorry, my English.
Okay.
My institute, we have the journal. The name is Somos Americano, Revista de Estudios Transfronterizos, and I want to invite for cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, our second presentation, the Shiva Mohan, I'm going to correct it, Migrant Solidarity in Post-Colonial Territories, the case of Venezuelan and Trinidad and Tobago.
Yep. All right, thanks so much, Henry. Now, I will transport you from one end of the continent, more north in the Caribbean Sea, very close to Venezuela, to a twin island nation called Trinidad and Tobago. I've sort of ordered the presentation. There's a kind of mapping of what I want to talk about. We may not follow this exact mapping, but you know, it's just a guide. I want to tell you about the motivations of why I came to this project, Henry. That's the question. In 2015, when I started thinking about when I started my PhD, I was doing a topic that was totally different from the Venezuelan situation. So I started on September, and I went home for vacation in December, for Christmas break. And I observed that more people were speaking Spanish in a nation that is an English-speaking nation.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed different kinds of products on the grocery shelves. And I saw more informal businesses popping up, like barbershops, etc. Entertainment, performance artists on the streets, which is not, it's not part of Trinidad and Tobago culture. And I was like, something is afoot here. What is happening? And of course, the mainstream media was talking about the economic and political crisis, and which has devolved into a social crisis and now a humanitarian crisis, right? The Venezuelan crisis is seen as a multidimensional eventuality, prolonged at that. And as a result of that, Venezuelans were coming to Trinidad. They were coming to Trinidad, and so the landscape, the social, the economic landscape was changing. But one thing was different, or one thing was peculiar, was that the government was silent on the matter. the government was not saying anything about the Venezuelan crisis or the inflow of Venezuelans to the island. And I found that peculiar as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about it as we go along. The idea behind my presentation today is to kind of to come up with an idea of the kinds of solidarities that exist as a result of this Venezuelan migration crisis, the impact and its outcomes on in Trinidad. I just want to give a little bit of context here, and I'm sure Natalie will build on this kind of context setting that I'm presenting here today. And Marcella talked about the 7.1 million people, and according to that statistic there, it's 7.2 of which in March 2023, people who have left Venezuela. But interestingly as well, over 6 million of those people reside in Latin American and Caribbean countries. So there's a significant, a pronounced south-south migration dynamic happening there, right? They're staying in the south. And there's a projected figure, according to the Regional Refugee and Migrant Response Plan, that at the end of 2024, that number is going to rise to 6.82 million refugees from Venezuela in the LAC region. While researching this, and people who've heard me talk about this before, have coined it the Maduro migration. And not only is it to represent, Maduro was overseeing this period of time, but also it's different from previous emigrations which have taken place in Venezuela in terms of its composition, its scale, its urgency. People are it's a fundamental matter of survival that people emigrating from Venezuela, which, by the way, has changed the profile of Venezuela from in-migration to sending country now, right? In terms of what that means for Trinidad and what has been happening, so Venezuelan migration to Trinidad is not new. My colleague here, Natalie, has conceptualized and substantiated a term, what she calls the Venezuela Trinidad and Tobago Migration Corridor, because the routes, ROUTS, are historically steeped, right? There was lots of mobilities between the two territories, from as far back as missionaries, from as far back as Venezuelans coming to Trinidad to learn English, from as far back as when Venezuela was rich, you call them expatriates, come and they help train people in Trinidad in the oil and gas industry, etc. And so Venezuelans sort of occupied a privileged position, right? They were looked up at, right? That they had knowledge, it was a rich nation, etc. In terms of so in 2018, at sort of the midway from now, Trinidad was coined as being the recipient of the largest number of Venezuelan migrants in Southern Caribbean. But I will hasten to say that these statistics are contested, right? A lot of the movement I can't say a lot, I don't know for sure, is irregular migration across the body of water called the Gulf of Paria, or locally the Bocas, between Venezuela and Trinidad. People taking dangerous boat journeys between the two nations, that sort of thing. So the initial figures were as suggested by the UNHCR were 40 to 60,000 people. Imagine that, 40 to 60,000 people entering a nation of 1.4 million people. So that would have had this is why when I went back home in December, I saw the significant changes in the landscape. But this number is contested and continues to be contested. But we'll come to something else when the government actually did decide to do something about the situation. So this map, which a colleague and I came up with, sort of maps the routes. I was talking about the Gulf of Paria, that body of water, where people depart from Venezuela, take these boat journeys to different points in Trinidad. And of course, if you can afford a plane ticket, you can fly from Caracas to Piaco. Was that my time?
No, that was not any time. Okay, sorry.
All right, so in terms of looking at this, in terms of looking at the question of solidarity in a post-colonial state, I was thinking through, and this is a very sort of preliminary take, so I welcome your comments and advice later on. Are these three conceptual entry points which I've like pulled up to thread through and to help me think through what migrant solidarities look like in Trinidad and Tobago. And that when we think about post-colonial states, especially a country like Trinidad and Tobago, who only became an independent nation in 1967. So that's about 60 years ago. It's a young nation. It's a quote unquote new nation. And the concept of sovereignty in itself has a particular significance for islands because of its remoteness, its uniqueness. There's a whole conceptual debate about what sovereignty looks like and what sovereignty means, and particularly from Caribbean scholars who have called the concept fragile, and they have called it an empty concept. They have called it a Eurocentric ideal which has been implanted onto this new nation, and these new nations are expected to aspire to certain thresholds and in terms of for example, the global financial landscape, that sort of thing. I just want an example of that could be the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, who has been advocating on behalf of CARICOM in the Caribbean to reformulate these sort of Bretton Woods institution like the World Bank to get more funding. So for example, she says rich countries when they take loans, have an interest rate of 1 to 4%, while poorer countries have to pay an interest rate of 14%.
Yeah.
And so these sort of, I won't say unattainable, but these challenging aspirations that poorer countries have to aspire to, these thresholds that these countries have to aspire to, are difficult, right? And especially impacted and amplified and can be seen clearly in new nation states like Trinidad. The second sort of theoretical thread I was looking at is what colleagues last year, in 23, in I think it's the Migration Policy Journal, Nata, Norman, and Stell called strategic non-regulation. So when I myself was trying to conceptualize, so why is the Trinidad and Tobago government not saying anything on this matter? Apparently, this, not just for the Trinidad and Tobago concept, but for other countries who are experiencing inflows, etc. Their governments have also been quiet. So I initially, when I was thinking about it, I called it strategic silences, or I called it strategic inaction with the brackets in front of the in, around the in. But clearly, colleagues, you think they came up with a name for it, right? So this has been happening, and this is observed across disciplines, etc. I think it's a really good article where they have identified it as a core feature of migration governance. Now, they also say that this sort of non-approach is it's not an ambiguous by chance happenstance sort of approach. It is deliberate. It is conscious, right? And they have suggested a couple of reasons, and I'll tell you now, about why countries deliberately and consciously choose to engage in this, as I call it, strategic silence, strategic inaction, that sort of thing. Because what it does, it's a form of outsourcing responsibilities to different actors, right? For example, domestic NGOs, which later on, why it fits my sort of analysis around solidarities, we'll see feature there. It's a means to maximize flexibility and leeway where inaction and perceived ambivalence allow actors to placate different audiences or stakeholders at the same time. Thirdly, it's a tactic to avoid accountability where vague, ill-defined, or absent rules and mandates obstruct transparency and allow for impunity. And fourthly, it's a disciplinary strategy where it creates an institutional landscape determined by uncertainty and unpredictability that increases the discretionary power of authorities. Without rules, you can move the parameters as you please. And the third sort of theoretical thread, where I'm trying to help me think through this is Harold Bauder's work on the politics of place and migrant solidarity, and of course his book with Johnny Darling, the later book with Johnny Darling, talks about, although he uses, his argument is based on urban sanctuaries, sanctuary cities that Anna was talking about before. He also mentioned that solidarity is less focused. Now some scholars have used solidarity as less focused on a national scale. And I will use it in my sort of analytical thinking about these solidarities. They move away from the national scale, but highlight bonds of empathy and common humanity. He talks about place-based politics as is observed in his title, where he says, on the one hand, politics relate to the local presence of international migrants and refugees, and on the other hand, they capture the relations between places and scales, including transnational and global connections. And what I like about Harold's invocation in the work of, for example, Harsha Walia or Naomi Peik, their work is how they sort of align, they're able to visibly show some parallels and convergences between the indigenous struggle and those of the migrant struggle as well, in the kinds of solidarities that they form. So I was thinking about these three sort of conceptual entry points, and this is what I've come up with, and I welcome your thoughts. Overlaying migrant solidarities onto post-colonial island setting unhides the constraints, limitations, and what I would suggest that the moral deficiencies which governments often reproduce. Solidarity practices at both the local and international levels is obviously impacted, the kinds of practices, it is impacted by such limitations. In the context of crisis, and of course the geopolitically fraught circumstances of the Venezuelan crisis, invariably what often happens is a shift in the burden of responsibility from the shoulders of the state to that of the immigrant serving agencies such as multinational organizations, local organizations, etc. And coming back, so tying back to the strategic non-regulation which the Trinidad state had engaged with for a long time, this clears the way for governments to not assume blame, paint a picture of their own solidarities with external political agendas, while at the same time positioning, shoring up their autonomy and self-preservation. So I'll just, again, a little idea of what sort of regulates, like it's on the books that regulates the immigration and migration landscape in Trinidad is the Immigration Act, Chapter 1801 of 1969, and I told you Trinidad became independent in 1967, right? In 2014, the government, not the present administration, another government, drafted the national policy to address refugee and asylum matters in Trinidad and Tobago. And of course, Trinidad is signatory to the convention, but there are no domestic laws to operationalize the protections inherent in those in the convention. But what they have is, in 2017, a standard operating procedures. And as you can see the quote there, unless or until there is a law, a refugee law in Trinidad, the standard operating procedures remain the authority. So remember I told you about the strategic silences, the strategic inaction, it's the strategic non-regulation. In 2019, the government did something. Finally, the government did something. They implemented what was called the migration registration exercise. And in simple terms, that is a labor exempt permit, but they issued an amnesty for 2 weeks for all Venezuelans to present themselves to the state, which I critique in our writing, make themselves visible, survey, bring themselves to be surveilled, etc. But they did not automatically get the work permit exemption. They had to clear that, be approved, they had to qualify for it, no criminal record, etc., etc. So that is fraud within itself. Contrary or a new evolution of Venezuela-Trinidad relations, historically, Venezuela and Trinidad, there was no visa instrument between the nations. Venezuelans could go to Trinidad as tourists without a visa, 3 months, they could extend the stay if they wanted to, etc. As soon as the migration registration exercise was implemented, they implemented a visa regime as well to make it a little bit more challenging for Venezuelans to actually get to Trinidad. And this is what I was talking about the numbers. So I just read about 2 days ago, since 2019, that that they've extended the migration framework, the registration framework. So the numbers, according to that 60,000 initial figure that I told you, initially they had registered 16,532 Venezuelans. We won't get into how fraud that is and how possibly incorrect that is as well. If they 13,000 re-registered in 2021, and so far 9,133 have been registered, just to tell you the numbers. What has happened is, or what has happened is, with the migration registration framework and the pronouncement by the government, discourse of refugee and asylum seekers has been erased from the migration conversation in Trinidad. People, they are framing all migrants now as economic migrants based on their action. However, what this does now is it leaves a loophole of the everyday for the actual Venezuelan migrants themselves. So they give them this framework, this labor exam framework. You can work in Trinidad for 6 months at a time. What now, right? Who takes care of the everyday needs? And so I think that in terms of the kinds of solidarity practices that we see, of course, from the NGOs, the CSOs, but especially in Trinidad, the faith-based organizations, and especially the Catholic Church, has stepped in to bridge the gap. The Living Water Community Ministry for Migrants and Refugees, it's an NGO in Trinidad from the Catholic Church, also the implementing partner of the UNHCR in Trinidad and Tobago. And they have a seat at the table with Ministry of National Security, who oversees immigration as well. The SOPs, the standard operating procedures that I talked about earlier, they act as a surveillance mechanism for the government, because everybody who registers an asylum seeker with Living Waters that information has to be communicated to the government. I see I'm running out of time. You're very strict on the time here.
Yeah.
And so this second sort of, which is a stark problem in Trinidad, is access to education. Just 1 minute. Access to education. Trinidad is signatory to United Nations Convention on Human Rights, which affords equal opportunity for children to access education. According to that Immigration Act of 1969, I think it was, children are not allowed, unless they go through the formal processes, to access education, right? There was no provision for this sort of quote unquote crisis or inflow of people. So in 2019, Equal Place is a non-formal education program which sought to take care of the children in Trinidad. Of course, it's a joint initiative, but again, you see the Catholic Church coming up here with after 2015 until 2023. So last term, September, the government finally allowed children to enter into the actual public school system. However, just like the migration registration framework, there were checkpoints you have to pass through, and that is the English assessment, right? The English assessment, and of course, the parent must be registered. So it does not account, it's not a true figure, that figure is low, and it just puts hindrances. Anyway, so as I was alluding to earlier, it's a shifting in the responsibility to protect. The government has made no concrete policy changes or legislative changes or developments to address in a sustainable way the Venezuelan inflow. And so this is kind of analysis. I don't know if maybe it's concluding thoughts rather than take homes, right? I want to talk, and the title of my presentation talks about post-colonial territories. And so what does this mean if you overlay the Venezuelan situation? I believe that the inaction of strategic non-regulation are As a result, Natalie and I write about the hauntings of the post-colonial experience. And so I believe that the vestiges and specters of colonialism mark the parameters and progress of state policy and action, even in the present day. Colonial codes are being reproduced in the contemporary moment, directing this non-regulation strategy. And states are operating within a limit, of course, structurally inherited from post-colonial experience, politically inherited from post-colonial. But I also believe psychologically, because in order for things to happen, there must be political will. And autonomy and self-determining processes are incredibly fragile, according to our politicians. And so they refuse, or it's a challenge for them to give up decision-making power to anybody else, right? For example, a regional bloc, that sort of thing. And of course, the state, I believe that working within the constraints, structural constraints, the kinds of solidarity practices that are generated are, in fact, ultimately limited by states in action and structural limitations. Okay, I went over my time.
Yeah, thank you. We have a couple of minutes. Thank you very much. Give me a second. To follow the guideline here, please. Here it is. Who? It is, our third is Mercedes Isabel. Am I pronouncing Isabel? Isabel Bono. Boto. Isabel, well, Venezuelan and Argentina migration policy. Does geopolitical matter?
Okay, thank you, Henry. Yes. Hi, everybody. Thanks to Ana, Shiva, and Omar for this invitation and all organizers. I'm very pleased to be here and to share with you some of the results of a project that we are doing at Flaxo, Facultad Latinoamericana de Ciencias Sociales in Argentina. In that research, it is regard about how governments, the research at Flaxo is about how governments from Chile and Argentina are addressing with the Venezuelan exodus, and which are the problems that Venezuelans face in achieving full and effective access to rights. And the main idea that I want to share and demonstrate in this presentation is, in opposite of what my colleagues have said before, is that Argentina is a successful case of integrating Venezuela. And to start my presentation, I want to share with you this image that I took from the website. In my view, this image depicts the perspective of a Venezuelan woman in Argentina and Chile. In Chile, she encounters numerous opportunities, like flowers, but unfortunately, all these flowers are beyond her reach. Like, for example, accessing to higher education, or even buying dollars for remittances. Why? Because it's very challenging due to the requirements to have a RUT, that is the Registro Único Tributario, that is very difficult to access. While in the case of Argentina, there are less opportunities, at least one flower, that is the access to documents that makes her happy. So turning back to my presentation, what I want to demonstrate in this presentation is that it is not only a problem, or it is not a passive an incentive about documents in Argentina, but there are another type of factors more related with the agency, like the type of flows of Venezuela that have come to Argentina, the timing, and also the size of these flows that also have contributed to this effective integration. And for demonstrate this, my argument, I divided the presentation in three parts. The first, I will talk about some features of the Argentina migratory tradition. Then we are going to the Venezuelan exodus and trying to compare the different responses that governments from South America has given to this phenomena. And lastly, I will try to characterize the profile of Venezuela that had came to Argentina, and trying to measure what I call the effective access to rights. So starting with Argentina migratory tradition, what we can say is that Argentina is a country with the longest migratory tradition in the region, that we can identify 3 waves, starting from the last decades of the 19th century, with a very massive migration of European people coming from Italy and Spain that were looking for work and to populate the territory, the very big territory. The second wave was after the global economic crisis to 1960s. It was composed mainly by regional migrants, more specifically from Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and they were coming because of the industrialized process. And the third wave, it was at the last decade of the 20th century. It was an Asian migration from Korea and from Taiwan. And they were coming because of political problems, not because of economic reasons. So what I want to emphasize is that despite this heterogeneous background, all norms and migration policy in Argentina has always favored the European profile. For example, regional migrants that had been, constantly during the whole constitution of the massive and modern Argentina, they had been neglected or invisible or also expelled by military governments. This is the situation until 2004, that in Argentina we create a new law. We approve a new law that is a law that wanted to give acknowledge to the regional migration by giving them the possibility of having a very easy process of regularization. But this law that is very, not famous, but it was from the vanguard in the region, is a law that recognizes migration as a human right and give all migrants the same rights to access to health, education, and work as nationals. And the last change or last innovation of this new law is the right to vote. So migrants have the right to vote for local authorities. Let's move to the second part of the presentation. I will go faster because my previous colleagues have talked about this, but taking in consideration the high number of people moving from Venezuela, almost 8 million. What can we say is that we can divide this exodus in 3 phases, depending on profiles and destination. The first phase was during the Gobierno de Chávez government, and it was the healthy and upper classes that went towards northern countries, North America, Canada, and Europe. The second one is the one that could not go to the northern countries, and they stay in the Caribbean countries and also South America. And the current phase is the one that is after the coronavirus pandemic, and it is The second was about middle class and lower class, but now we have more vulnerable sectors that are moving in a collective way through caravanas and in certain corridors that goes from Colombia towards the South Cone, or from the South Cone, they are going to United States. What I want to emphasize that in the South American countries, the distribution of Venezuela was not equal, and the most affected were obviously those countries that were on the borders. In the case of Argentina, Colombia received, according to the latest data from the R4P platform, received 2.5 million of Venezuela. Argentina is in the 5th place and has like 20,000 Venezuela in Argentina that are concentrated, especially in the bigger city and especially in Buenos Aires, because they love Buenos Aires.
Everybody loves everybody.
So you are all invited. And to end this part of the presentation, I want to share the idea that what the responses of Southern American governments was unilateral. With this, I wanted to say that Southern governments abandoned previous regional commitments about immigration, but also abandoned the forums for coordination, these topics that they used to use, like Mercosur, UNASUR, and La Comunidad Andina, and prefer another type of more soft regional forums, like El Proceso de Quito. And although, and despite these governments took different and unilateral responses to this exodus, the literature identified 3 patterns. The first pattern is the one that were taken by countries such as Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Chile, that they introduced ad hoc measures like the humanitarian visas for Venezuelans. Other countries like Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil, they use what we call Mercosur citizenship. That means we gave the Venezuelan the same rights as the other migrants that come from the countries, the neighboring countries, like that they can move only by the only criterion of nationality. So they do not have to have work. They can move freely in the region. And finally, third strategy, or 10, is the one that has adopted Bolivia and Paraguay, that they decided not to change their rules, their previous rules, and they did not offer Venezuela any special entry or permanence in their country. So I want to go more deeper into the Argentina strategy to show what? To show, in contrast of what was Shiva saying before, that Argentina, and especially Macri right-wing administration, use this migratory exodus for political proposals. And in the diplomatic arena, Macri endorsed Trump's plans to isolate Maduro, and he personally advocated the idea of expulsion, the decision of Venezuela expulsion from the Mercosur region, for the Mercosur bloc. But on the domestic area, on the one hand, he facilitated the regularization process for Venezuelan migrants by eliminating fees and eliminating also and allowing them to enter without any document as passport or identity card for children. While on the other side, and for the other migrants in the country, what he did was to implement stricter controls and also accelerating deportation timelines for the other migrants. So the idea is that this use of policy immigration for political aims have a good result. And between 2060 and 2020, there was like the number of Venezuela surged between 15,000 to 80,000 people entering the country. So we reach now to the third part of the presentation. I want to give you the idea of how are these flows composed. And I am going to use that data that was taken from the first national migration survey that we are doing under the umbrella of CONICET, that is our research council institute in Argentina. That data was taken in 2020. So now we are in the second edition of this survey, but the data are not available till now. And from this data from 2020, what we can say is that Venezuelans migrants are mostly slightly more composed by women than from men. That it is a very young population. That people from 18 to 50 are more or almost 90% of the population. That when they come, they are coming or married 50%, 55%, or alone 34%. And okay, this is the publication. You can go to see this type of to go deeper with this type of description. But this is the data I like to show, is that there are 67% are professional and 30% are university students, and only 3% are people that hasn't finished the high school. And lastly, they have money to do. So the idea of this description is to suggest that they belong to middle, professional, and affluent sectors. So after saying this, I want to describe, to measure how effective is their access to rights in Argentina. And in terms of regulation, what we can say, what I said before, is that Venezuela has the same rights that migrants coming from neighboring countries. That means that they have an easy access to the identity card that for us is called Documento Nacional de Identidad. And after 2 years of permanence in the country, they can choose for the permanent residence or to naturalize themselves. And according to this survey that I will call ENMA, because it's ENMA, almost 88% by those years have already obtained their documents, while other migrants that have more time in the country were like 93%. And in terms of the option of residence, what we see is that this chart is comparing Venezuela with other countries. of migrants of other countries that in Argentina are mainly from Paraguay, Bolivia, and Peru. And what we see in this chart is that they are not interested in naturalization. Oh, yes, I have 5 minutes.
No, 1.45.
In terms of work, they have the same employment rate with other migrants. The difference comes in terms of the type of work they prefer to work for others, and in terms of sectors where they are hired, and they work for the service sector, especially the one linked with hospitality industry, and their rate in terms of informality are very higher. And this is what I want to
say.
say.
Occupation
Yes.
is high, medium occupation
It's
or high,
medium.
medium?
Is a medium rate in relation with the nationals. Nationals are 98.9. The Venezuela are 82.2%.
Yeah, not in terms of people employed, like percentage of, yeah.
Of them.
Yeah.
And this is something that I found interesting, is that there's a mismatch between what they know and what they do. And in terms of public health, I will try to run. In terms of public health, there's a very particular thing, is that they pay in terms of access. They are users, but they are also providers, because there are a lot of doctors that are working in the public and the private sector. But this is a very interesting difference with other migrants, is that they don't like public health, because they distrust on the quality and so they use it as a second best. So when they enter the country, you have 88% of Venezuela use the public system, but when they have reached a good job, they prefer to pay for it. In terms of access to education, is totally the contrary. They lack the public, and they use a lot of public education, and they enjoy a very good recognition from the society and the community, or school community, because they have a very good performance. And this is just the opposite of what is happening with the Bolivians or Paraguayans, that still now they have a very negative stigmatization. And finally, and it's a very interesting point, is what about political participation. Venezuela has a lower rate of political participation in local by 2020, because it is changing nowadays in local elections. They also have, and now is still less, a very low rate of participation in national elections in Venezuela. But what is very interesting is that they are very active in social organizations. And this is a chart that shows that they have a lot of participation in church, because they culturally are very religious. But what is amazing in Argentina is their capacity to organize themselves in organization of migrations. And for example, from 2016 to 2023, they passed from 1 NGO to 51 organizations of migrants, and most of them are professional. So to wrap up my presentation, what I want to say is that, answering my initial question, geopolitical reasons have been very important to achieve documents, but documents and access of rights are not the only factors that are important to have effective inclusion. I mean effective inclusion, that means also the social recognition and the capacity to lobby to the governments. And I think that Venezuela did it.
Thank you very much.
Very welcome to Buenos Aires and to my institution.
Yes, yes, thank you. Okay, I'm sorry. Checking my.
Sorry for the time.
Okay, no problem. No problem. Natalie Dietrich John, is that all right? Insight from the small island developing state in the Caribbean.
Right, so afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me at the back? Okay. Somebody say no. Hopefully the voice will go up. Right, so I'm happy to be here and just would like to echo the thanks for the warm invitation and the ability to be here. I should have been here in November. It didn't work out, but I'm here and just happy to share in this session. And I'm seeing a lot of parallels between the papers. Although I have a small bone to pick with Shiva because I see some tensions between what I will present, which can be explored in the Q&A. So I will be presenting on crises, catastrophic equilibrium tipping points, looking at Venezuelan migration and policy development in the Southern Caribbean. It's actually 4 case studies, which means I have a very difficult task to try to put everything together in a short period of time, but I'll try my best. And as Shiva mentioned, in a space that is very under-theorized for migration studies generally, but especially in relation to refugee crises. I'll try to do it in 3 steps. I'm gonna reflect a little bit about doing migration research on crises, in context of crises, and I'll explain that in a second. And then I will talk through some regional and national contextual issues, and then the theoretical. And so the second part of the presentation is really divided into 2. I present some empirical findings on each of the case studies and then move on to some hopefully theory making on what it means to have a responsive migration state in a crisis context, and recommend some options for the region generally, because the Southern Caribbean is of course just a small part of a much wider geographical space. So the crisis has been a constant theme in discourse. This is political discourse, although it's not been very well defined. So governments say there is a crisis, but they're not willing to provide specifics beyond statements of incapacity. And Shiva kind of touched on that earlier. So this has made it difficult to investigate crisis and the constitutive nature of that crisis within the context of migration governance. And that's even more challenging across 4 geographical spaces that, even though they're in the same region, present different challenges because of different political structures. So in order to do this research and to plug some of those data silencers that we encountered, this is me and Shiva now talking, in our independent but also collaborative research, we've had to triangulate qualitative data from the interviews that we do manage to get, which are quite limited, as well as media sources and gray literature. The R4B platform in particular has been very helpful, but there are international organizations like IOM, ILO, doing research in this area, and that has been helpful in trying to understand the scenario that we're presented with. So if you don't know a lot about the region, it's composed of small island developing states. And those are countries which by definition are shaped by crises. They experience exogenous and endogenous shocks, basically almost, I would say routinely. If we think about environmental issues, for example, we have a very tense period between June and November where we expect to receive hurricanes, and we count our blessings when we don't. But then if you don't have a hurricane, you might have a volcanic eruption or an earthquake. And that's just an environmental, from the environmental side. So we're prone to exogenous and endogenous shocks, which have multidimensional effects, but also temporal effects, because a lot of these shocks have enduring impacts across the socioeconomic sectors of society. In literature, which I'm looking at, maybe I would say 3 broad categories of literature for this paper. The emphasis has been on the economic and environmental crises, and a lot of discussion around how cities can be resilient to these issues. But there is very little on migration crises, although there has been research looking at outward migration as a crisis scenario, because we have some of the highest rates of outward emigration in the world. Guyana, which is one of the case studies, and even Trinidad and Tobago are among the top 20 countries with the highest rates of outward emigration globally. So that's where the literature has focused in the past, but there is a gap in research on refugee crises. So where does the Venezuelan scenario fit in all of this? So Venezuela has historic connections between all the 4 countries that I mentioned, but it's reflected in different ways. And what that means is that it was difficult to identify precisely when the crisis emerged, although we do have some markers. So post 2014, which is when people tend to identify as the onset of the crisis, we start to see a few things. The change in the composition of the types of migrants, but we also see heightened precarity in terms of the modes of travel. So they're increasingly traveling by boat, so taking very dangerous journeys, and this has resulted in an increase, based on what IOM has reported, in missing migrants. But it also has resulted in heightened surveillance by the state. So more patrolling of territorial waters, but also land borders in the case of Guyana, and also increase in deportation of Venezuelans. When this is early on in the crisis, it's 2018, a UNHCR representative had said that Venezuela crisis for the Caribbean was on the scale of Syria. I'm going to show some another graph in a sec. But essentially, despite our small size and receiving the least number of Venezuelans relative to the size of our populations, it's actually a challenge. And you'll see that on the graph on the right, where you will see the percentage of the population that's constituted by Venezuelans. And on my left, you will also see the significant increase in arrivals. This is a little bit problematic, and we can talk more about it later in terms of how we measure crisis and so on. But the stock that you see reflected there from UN data, they say stock of refugee and asylum seekers. When you compare it to the numbers that R4V provides, it's actually very similar, but that number would also include regularized Venezuelans who live in these countries. So there's a little bit of a challenge there. And as I said, we can talk through that a bit in the Q&A if you wish. So like Shiva, I'm trying to understand crisis, and I'm reading it in a different way. I've tried to use the literature, some economic/political science literature that talks about how states respond to or recover from crisis. And I have identified the Venezuelan crisis as a tipping point for the Caribbean countries because of of where we were starting from. We have a very weak governance structure, and so if with the onset of the crisis, one possibility is to bounce forward and to have transformative change in the migration governance space, or to remain where we're at and end up in catastrophic equilibrium, which is not very good for the migrants, and you'll see why in a second. So just to give some context, all 4 countries lack an overarching policy governing migration management. And there is a difference between the pace of ratification. This is in relation to the 1951 Refugee Convention and the 1967 Protocol, as well as compliance. So what you're seeing here is, of all 4, Trinidad and Tobago has signed onto the 51 Convention and Protocol, and Aruba has, for the 1967 Convention Protocol, it's acceded, but Curacao and Guyana have not, right? So you have a weak legislative framework, because once they haven't ratified, there is no impetus to introduce any national legislation. I mean, they could, but in our context, that's like the first hurdle would be the international space where you ratify the treaty. And that means then, so no national legislation, although there's a mix of policy which has emerged, especially in response to the crisis, and I'll go into that in the next few slides. So just as a clarifying point, Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago are former British colonies. Aruba and Curacao are former Dutch colonies, and that is a very huge complication in terms of moving forward in international treaty making, because they cannot on their own accord sign onto a treaty. They would need to have that undertaken by the Kingdom of the Netherlands. So what does all of this mean in terms of the crisis? It has resulted in what I'm calling contradictions based on what is in the literature. So you have no legal basis for refugee status determination. There's no work permit regime for undocumented migrants, limited capacity for reception. So when persons arrive, they have to either rely on their own networks, or they rely on the NGOs who are operating in this kind of gray space, or limited social integration. And the point I would like to make or advance is that, especially with respect to limited social integration, is that the crisis can change this landscape for migrants. So in terms of labor market inclusion, did the crisis actually result in the transformation or bouncing forward for these countries? And what I propose is that, to a degree, it has. So governments have demonstrated flexibility and openness to change with respect to the provision of temporary legal pathways, and this is the registration that Shiva would have mentioned for Trinidad and Tobago. And Guyana has also had a registration exercise, but that registration in Guyana has not translated into the ability to access the labor market, at least not formally. There's no work permit regime, and there is none in Curacao and none in Aruba. So even if you have been able to register as an asylum seeker, which is tricky in Aruba and Curacao, you do not have access to the labor market. And so across the board, despite the difference in the types of regimes that operate, you have a very high participation rate in terms of informality. What we're also seeing, and this is the part that I would like, I guess, to tease out some more as I pursue this theoretical framework, is that this gray space emerging. So governments don't have a work permit regime introduced, but migrants are working informally. And NGOs are actually providing training for migrants to offer different types of services through entrepreneurial ventures. So they may make chocolates, or they may be trained to operate in beauty parlors, for example. So you would think that if it's not permissible to work, then NGOs wouldn't be training people to provide these services, but yet this is happening, right? So there's a contradiction of sorts with respect to labor market inclusion. In terms of healthcare, there's also this difference emerging. So there is access to public healthcare in both Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana. But migrants, should they need it, because we're still unable to say for sure the degree to which migrants may in fact need access to health services, although it's said that maternal health and psychosocial support are maybe the two that would be most important. They're restricted by knowledge about where they can get these services, but also the language barrier in terms of speaking Spanish and trying to access public health care in an English-speaking setting. It's different in Aruba and Curacao, where you have to pay for healthcare. But in 2023, through the advocacy of a national NGO that was established post-crisis, migrants now can access private health insurance from 2 private healthcare providers. This is not, as far as I know, and I stand to be corrected if it's not the case, but this is not so in Aruba. And so again, what we see is this gray area emerging where NGOs have stepped in to fill the deficit that the governments have not been able to by providing critical health services to migrants. So maternal health, reproductive health services in general, services to special groups like LGBTQI who are underserved in these countries in general. So that's an important thing to note. All right, so we're seeing primarily catastrophic equilibria, or basically retaining the status quo, and not much transformation in terms of bouncing forward from the crises. And this is where maybe the time is not showing. Okay, I'm good, I think. This is where Shiva and I kind of maybe clash a little bit. I'm gonna skip this one because I attribute it to different things, not necessarily the argument. Although I agree with those points, I'm attributing it to different things. So yes, the colonial legacy, but what has the colonial legacy done? It shaped a legislative framework and in conformity with norms on international norms on refugee and asylum. So what has essentially happened is, because these countries did not participate in negotiation of the international regime system, and basically transition to independence with an exclusionary migration framework, they have inherited this restrictive policy sphere, and there's been little incentive to change that. And so they've had to contend with large numbers of arrivals in a post-colonial setting that is hostile to vulnerable migrants, right? And that could change if they wanted it to, but what Shiva is essentially explaining is why that wouldn't necessarily happen. The other issue is this negative path dependence. So although we've had sustained migratory crisis in other parts of the region, and we think about Cuba and Haiti in particular, Aruba, Curacao, Guyana, and Trinidad and Tobago have been largely insulated from this, right? And this geographical distance has resulted in a weak governance or policy framework that would be necessary to support what Riguglio calls nurtured resilience. He's writing about economic matters, but I'm translating it to this context. So what we have is essentially this negative path dependence reproducing a policy environment that is ill-prepared for crisis scenarios, despite the fact that we experience crisis almost like every day, right? And then the last thing would be our small size and how that impacts on our resilience. So we have, in general, limited capacity. We don't have a lot of expertise, technical expertise in refugee and asylum issues, right? We have very limited financial resources as highly indebted countries, even though we're classified as middle income countries. And so the frequency and severity of multidimensional crisis constrains our already limited capacity. And what that means, and I'm drawing on work from Anna here, is that it's when the response happens, it's either situated or structural resilience and not necessarily the systemic resilience that we would need to have this transformation to bounce forward. Right, so conclusions. So it's important when we're looking at crises to examine the sum of the parts, and the sum of the parts here would be both the geographical units, but also the sectoral units. I've looked at labor, health, education. I didn't mention that just now because of time, and also asylum, right? So geographical units, the poor countries, but also the policy sectors. So Guyana, which interestingly had the least capacity to bounce forward because it had the weakest governance framework, has actually shown the most transformation. And this is mostly explained by political will in terms of how responsive the government has been. We don't see that in Aruba and Curacao, who have bounced back the least, I think, because of their inflexible migration policy regime, but also, as I mentioned, this colonial legacy and our continued colonial legacy in terms of the relationship that it has with the kingdom government. And then the changes in Trinidad, because of the registration framework, has seemed to be positive, but these are largely due to external and internal pressures from advocacy groups like local NGOs, but also the international organizations. And we didn't get a chance to talk about this, but we have discussed this geopolitics and how that has constrained Trinidad and Tobago's autonomy. And in terms of the theoretical, the ability to bounce forward is dynamic and contingent on historical and contextual factors. And in our case, this is small island developing states. The immutability of these factors undermines resilience. And so bouncing forward is actually constrained beyond the state's political will. So even if states didn't want to move ahead, it would be challenging because of these both inherent vulnerabilities that states face. Right, and what we've seen is that governments can demonstrate selective resilience. So they may choose to introduce policy that can transform migrant social integration in one area, so healthcare, for example, but they have not done that in the labor market. And I think this, yes, the last slide. So learning by doing is important for the region and for countries which have yet to experience a migratory crisis of this scale. There is a shorter learning curve if they can adopt or adapt the responses that these 4 Caribbean countries have introduced. And a part of that would necessarily entail 2 things. One is embedding legislative reform to support a migration protection space that is responsive to the needs of vulnerable migrants and not subject to the vagaries of political agendas. And then also addressing the inherent vulnerabilities. So how, if possible, to improve technical and human resources in order to get to that stage where there can be systemic resilience. I'm sorry to rush, but it is a lot because it's 4 countries, but I'm open to taking questions to have more detailed conversation on each of the cases. So thank you.
I know you have a lot of questions, but Anna told me that I had to sound smart, kind of summary. There are a few things that I found fascinating, really fascinating. I'm gonna put it in general. The border practices, you know, those who know me, I'm really interested in institution practices that generate a new way of developing the concept of border. Your example in it's a fascinating example.
Yes.
You can see the everyday living of people, and then there's the crisis, and new structures are developed. And I think each of the countries developed those border practices, which I find very interesting. I find that extremely interesting. Similarly, yeah. I found interesting that Shiva found interesting that the 84% of the Venezuela remain in South America. The majority of refugees are in the south. That is everything is clear too. But the north make more noise in Telma. But the north, they say Canada, wonderful, got 70,000. What is it? What group? Ukrainian is getting 1,000 Palestinian. So they make a lot of noise about that. But the majority remain in the south. See, you know, that's nothing new. Syria 4 million in Turkey. And Lebanon, 1.5 million. And Lebanon's a tiny thing. So I find very interesting that you found it interesting. That's a very interesting thing. The other phenomenon that I think all of you talk about, the enjoyization of the state. There, and the 4 of you mentioned it, and the limitations of the weakness of the state structure force the NGOs to assume a higher responsibility. What I found very interesting, the strategic non-regulation, the strategic inaction, open the space for more NGOs to become part of the process. But I don't know, maybe any of you or anybody is going to be analyzing the economic and social implication of the NGOization within our small state, you know, because has consequences. I believe has consequences, and also how international organizations have tremendous influence into the, but way too much influence in the small countries. And both in Latin America and Caribbean. And Caribbean, and Caribbean. The other thing that nothing new, but damn the colonial impact on this driver. That would be, when is that going to go? It will be a couple of generations before the process goes. In the Latin America modernity, the coloniality, talk about that the colonization and the coloniality are 2 different things. The colonization, the main empire left the space. The coloniality, the law, the way of thinking remain in those spaces. And I think some of you have developed that process. The colonial, how codes are reproduced that don't reflect the everyday living of people living in those spaces. I found that fascinating. I like a lot the explanation of the 3 waves into Argentina, you know, it's, but all of you are very Hegelian. 3 and 3 and 3. I love that, very Hegelian, I love that, yeah. The whitening of Argentina, which is not just Argentina, Venezuela, Peru, and some of those countries, were a systematic whitening. The exclusion of the indigenous people over there, the self-replicated of the mestizo, and let's whitenize our community. In Argentina was very evident. In Canada, the white policies of nothing new, nothing new. I like the different level of coordination, different Peru, Ecuador, humanitarian business. That was amazing. I like some of the information that it reflects some of the stuff with experience here in Canada. There's a high level of education of the immigrants in Argentina. If I understand, the Venezuela, let's talk. Similar situation in Canada, the immigrant has much higher education, they can even born people. So there are certain things that they are similar. Let me see. I find very interesting in the absence of policies regarding refugee, the moment that somebody as an asylum seeker enter that space, it disappears. And I mean, if you disappear in front of the state, you don't exist. I mean, you don't exist. There is no recognition of your presence, although you everyday living, you are very active in the activity. I find that very, very interesting. Then, yeah, I like you let us know the influence of Netherlands and British and those colonies. I have a lot. Oh, you mentioned there is a crash between you and Shiva. I want to know about crash. I'm a social worker. I want crisis, you know. Conflict. That's what crash. But on the other hand, you mentioned a lot about the political resilience of this monster. You know, and you know what I like a lot? The political resilience. We talk about resilience and the psychological part, which drives me crazy. But you are putting in the realms of political. There is a political resilience. And how do you mention? You mentioned there is resilience within the immutability of the things. You know? Maybe you can explain a little bit that concept of catastrophic equilibrium. I like it. Sounds fancy. Catastrophic. I really like. There is more stuff, but I think some of you may have some questions. The table is open to questions, and our colleagues in internet are open to questions, comments. Yes,
I always have questions and.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Help the others gather their thoughts. Well, thank you all for a set of very interesting papers that I think actually both contribute to our understanding of the Venezuelan flows to the region, and very rightfully, I think the critique that, as you said, Henry, most of the people seeking protection or a better future, or both at the same time, are in the whatever we call the global south, not the global north. So I have actually two comments that I think. So one comment is general, the geography. So it strikes me we have like Trinidad Tobago and Island, and in Natalie studied 4 countries, which are not all islands, but they are anyhow. It's so 2 things, and then we have the passage on the Altiplano, which is also very like the morphology, the geography of the place is very specific. And initially, I wasn't understanding what was the issue, but obviously the port cities are the passage to to a whole. Kind of a whole set of channels for people and goods to move. So would we say that this is important? I mean, we've theorized a lot about islands, but I was thinking, is this about the morphology of the geography? Now, I think this is less the case for Argentina, but for the other case studies that we heard, and to what extent this morphology shapes the policy responses, because it occurs to me that in Iquique, that was a crisis, and in Colchán, because of the very particular morphology of that area, and same in the islands, we have both the symbolic connotation of the island being, you know, an enclosed space, so difficult to enter, but then also for people difficult to leave. And then another comment about the symbolic aspect, and I don't know if you will feel that it is too far sought a comparison between, but I'm thinking, like, I come from Southern Europe, and I started, actually the reason why I turned to migration from something else that I was studying for my PhD was that suddenly after 1989, Southern European countries that were traditionally emigration countries, and you talked about it, Mercedes, became immigration countries overnight. And while in Italy and Greece, there was no symbolic connection for people, including civil society actors, between the emigration and the immigration history or experience, in Spain there was. At least in my own work, we're talking mid-1990s, like civil society actors in Spain saying there's more Spaniards abroad than there are immigrants in Spain still. So that I think no one of you is finding this connection. So why we don't find this connection? I think this is a general question, why usually people either don't think of them or their ancestors being immigrants, being emigrants, so facing, or if they find it, they say, oh, we were different, those times were different, we were good, we were educated, we were law-abiding, etc. So if you have any particular reflection on what is in the national culture, because I think we have many different cases, like of course the post-colonial hangover, as Al has called it, like the post-colonial hangover or the decolonial hangover, and then of course very different in, I think, Chile and Argentina, the narrative. And just the third question that I think it's very interesting, if we think even about Trinidad Tobago, Shiva was doing the calculation, that's 1.2 to 2 million people in Canada, if that gives any sense of the size of the crisis. But then I was looking into where's the paper of Natalie, and we're talking 20%, like in Aruba, it's 17%, Curacao 10%, Guyana 2.5%, and Trinidad Tobago 2.53%. Well, still 3% in a short period of time. And then, for instance, how does this sort of compare with Turkey and the Syrians? And I don't know, here might help with a shift calculation, about 3 million, no, over 3 million people in 80 million, no, in 70 million people. So 3.5, yeah, which is still huge. So anyhow, just a reflection about the numbers. And I was thinking Malta has been such a case in Southern Europe where I remember Malta in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s arguing that, I don't know, 2,000 people in Malta are like 400,000 people in Spain or something like that.
Really?
Yeah. I know, but just some food for thought.
Question, yeah, go.
I'd like to follow up on Anna's question. Now, in the case of the US, the reason we see Trump gaining so much popularity, the primary reason is uncontrolled immigration from the southern border. The primary reason that the Brits had Brexit in 2016, the primary reason was what they thought of as uncontrolled immigration. The question is, does this same logic apply to Latin America? In the case of President Milei, for example, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name properly, but is the influx of immigrants, when it's unregulated, promoting right-wing anti-immigrant sentiment, especially at the policy level?
Yeah. Do you want to answer that question, or do you want more questions?
Yes. Migration is not in the agenda of Milei. Isn't. No, Argentina is, I mean, it's a atypical case. what I mean with this. Migration it's like a national issue. It's good to be inclusive. Till now, that we are in a very deep crisis. But I think it will be an issue, but not now, because Mireille is trying to change more structural things, and not, it doesn't appear as an issue. The only point about migration is in terms of if migrants have the same, or it's good to them to let enter university by free. That is the only thing that in his 300 measures, he's trying to promote, appears like something for migration. That I totally agree. I don't think that is good in a very, it's not a poor country, but in a country with a very big state debt, to still allowing people to enter. But I think that measures should be for all the same, not for migrants. I mean, it's not good to have a university for everyone without having any requirement, but not for migrants. I am pro migrants in that sense.
So Marcelo, how do you see it? Is there any xenophobic reaction to that process that you described? And we have to clarify, Bolivia and Chile, they are always in clashes, but friendly clashes.
No, because Chile, I said, no, they don't have relationship.
There is no diplomatic relation between the two countries, yeah.
Years ago.
72.
And
1972,
yes,
after your article.
yes. The immigration no promote the xenophobia alone, because yo te ayudo porque respondo. Chile se inscribe tarde en el mapa migratorio general.
Chile in the immigration process is a little bit late compared with other countries.
Difference, for example, Argentina. For example, today is 8% the population is one. It's a little that. But in the pandemic, this phenomena, no migration alone, yes. No, the management, cómo se gestionó el fenómeno. Esa es la razón probablemente más compleja.
It's not the migration in itself what creates some issue. It's how it was managed politically and in the process of engagement.
Una ineficiente política.
There was inefficient policies.
Exacto. Por ejemplo, las personas llegaban, iban a las residencias sanitarias, salían de allí, pero ya no tenían dónde estar. Entonces, la pandemia.
Okay, you're talking Spanish now.
Yeah.
Okay, sometimes. Okay, sorry. I forgot. Sometimes they went to the health services. They get the services, but then they end up on the street and they don't have the resources to do what they are advised.
Okay. No, Chile no contaba con dispositivos de acogida, por ejemplo. No había registro de situaciones como esta.
Chile didn't have a structure to receive the immigrants coming into the country. It wasn't prepared for that.
Y la pandemia tensionó todo eso. Entonces, y eso se aprovechó desde la derecha, y lo llamativo es que las marchas, las personas no se sienten. O sea, si les decían que eran xenófobas, dicen, no somos xenófobos.
Yeah. Okay, well, all that. Okay, I'm about to translate it. Okay, so we're saying Chile wasn't prepared for that kind of event. There was some reaction, and in the article you mentioned there was a very large and protest against the
Yes.
immigration. Yeah, so the right, people on the right took advantage of that and start promoting anti-immigrant process. Yeah, if I understood correct.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
And no, only no xenophobic, I agree, apophobic too, because the people arrive impoverished, empobrecidos.
Yeah, impoverished people arrive as an immigrant, yeah.
This picture, I say that to Iquique is was very important point, touristic point in Chile. The immigrant, how do you say, affair.
Oh, yeah, so Iquique was a tourist area,
Yeah.
so, the immigrants make it look bad,
Yes,
they make it look dirtier.
yes.
Sounds
Because-
familiar?
Yeah.
Sounds familiar, yeah.
Because the people start in the beaches and the square and the touristical, the downtown.
Okay, thank you. Where was she? Oh, sorry. Any answer for the question? And your, and
I think, for Trinidad and Tobago, the state's position has been a vacillating one, depending on, and I'm not talking just about the Venezuelan situation, but it has, Natalie will tell you that, the ways for a long time, Trinidad, because we have this free movement agreement in CARICOM, and for a long time, because Trinidad was an oil and gas rich nation, a lot of the people, a lot of CARICOM nationals would move to, would go to Trinidad, as particularly Guyanese people and some Jamaicans, etc. And in the period just before 2015, Trinidad engaged in a deportation campaign. So we're not even talking about the Venezuelans here, right? They engaged in a deportation campaign, so that's a state's position. Even and who were they deporting? Jamaicans, Guyanese, those people. And even during the crisis, during the initial influx, they also engaged in deportation exercises, repatriation exercises, back to Venezuela. That's a state position. Migrants in Trinidad are there is anti-immigrant sentiment in Trinidad, generally. And so with the Venezuelan situation, those sentiments were amplified, right? Remember initially I told you that expatriates from Venezuela were looked up at, they were well respected. And so the profile or the perception of the Venezuelan shifted in the situation. In 2020, there was a local election, a national general election, and the opposition used the Venezuelan situation as a political point. As a, on one hand, they were saying, regularize Venezuelans. You're not doing the humanitarian thing. On the other hand, if you have Venezuelans here, they can use their card, and vote for you, right? So that's why I say, at least at the local level, it's a vacillating thing. But generally speaking, the people I've spoken to, they're like the textbook arguments around immigrants, stealing our jobs, and losing our culture. At one particular point, because in the Caribbean, Trinidad, there is a sex trafficking issue. And Latinas in particular, Trinidad has a history of Latino women being trafficked to Trinidad for sex purposes.
And so transit also to Europe.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so one of the arguments I came across frequently was Venezuelan women are here to take our husbands.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you.
Maybe just to add to what Sheba said, there is a lot of historical amnesia in terms of forgetting what Anna mentioned in terms of the patterns that would have shaped movement between these spaces for not just decades, but for centuries, especially in the case of Trinidad and Tobago. So nationals in these countries have forgotten that some of their ancestors may have Venezuelan origins or certainly migrant origins. They might be Guyanese, they might be Dominican or something. So that's maybe the first thing. The other thing which relates more to Curacao and Aruba. So we're in a hypermobile space, yes, but Aruba and Curacao have a very mixed profile in terms of the population. So there are almost 200 different nationalities in Aruba alone, right? Aruba is a very small place.
Yeah.
But
It is
isn't it like sunset migration?
oh, you mean like, well, in a way, but there is a lack of human resources, and so persons come to work. So separate from the persons who come maybe to retire, you do have skilled professionals moving to these countries to fill labor deficits because nationals can't. And there's also the other issue, which is the outward migration that is making this human resource deficit worse. So it's very, I wouldn't say peculiar because we see this narrative in other spaces, but it's very odd, especially in Aruba and Curacao, that have such a diverse population to have this xenophobic response. But even though Aruba and Curacao shared that similarity, there is a difference in the constitution of the ethnic population, and that fuels xenophobia more so in Curacao, which is more Afro-descended, than in Aruba, which has a more mestizo type ethnic profile. So there are intricacies between the four countries is the point I was trying to make. So even though we're in the same geographical space and we have these parallels, there are these intricacies that shape the response to the migrant population.
Thanks. Oh, sorry. No, there was one question and then you, okay. Yes, go ahead. There was a question.
Hi, thank you. My question is about the George specifically, but everybody, I'm wondering about the temporal dimension to the policies in the region. More like the policy diffusion from one country to another, and in terms of like who started it, and if it English or English, you know, and is that the common occurrence in like political science? And so, because it's kind of a new space, and so just wondering how different policies influence each other in terms of time.
So I think this is the question, especially for the international organizations that have been hoping that the positive response in South America would trickle over into our region, and we're not necessarily seeing that, I guess, to the degree that they would like. I actually wrote a question when I was doing this because I realized there's a, I guess, inherent bias in the way the paper was presented, because I'm assuming that the government's, I'm assuming that transformation in crisis would mean a more receptive policy environment, but that's not necessarily what the governments want. They may want to contain, which is why we're seeing the challenges that we're seeing, as opposed to creating an environment that's more receptive. So Guyana has been the most receptive. And the international organizations have been suggesting that it's the best practice for the region, but we're not necessarily seeing what you're calling the policy diffusion. And I think that's explained by different things. One, as I said, this difference in political structure and the colonial hangover for Aruba and Curacao. And then the other thing is just the very real issue about resources. The number in Guyana is less than in the other places. And in Guyana, some of them are actually indigenous Guyanese returning from Venezuela. So there's this whole issue about nationality because you have, you can claim Guyanese nationality through descent. And then just the whole issue of money. So if we were richer, hypothetically speaking, I'm not sure if the response would be the same. Because we would have the financial resources to put people in accommodation, to pay for health services, but we really don't. Because we have high rates of unemployment. We have persons in our own national context who don't have access to certain services, and that's where the xenophobia comes in. How can you give a Venezuelan healthcare when I don't have access to healthcare, I don't have a job? So it's kind of like this circular narrative because you want people to have access, but can you really give them access if your own national doesn't have some of these benefits? So that's the issue that the governments face.
Yeah, go ahead, my friend.
Just hinging on to Natalie's response. And I don't know if this is true, Natalie, but maybe we can look into it more. The migration registration framework that Trinidad implemented in 2019 was a strategy already used in a South American country. So perhaps that is part of this policy diffusion kind of conversation. And I also want to just shed light on an issue that is understudied and underserved in this whole Venezuelan crisis discourse, and Natalie raised it, is that of the indigenous peoples, especially the Warao people, W-A-R-A-O, who straddle the border between Venezuela and Guyana. And these people have actually moved to Trinidad, and some stay in Guyana, and some stay in, and especially that the Venezuela-Guyana border dispute has been escalated recently, even adding to the quote-unquote Venezuelan displacement issue. They've also gone, there are indigenous, I guess you'll call them organizations or nations in these various countries but I think that, you know, if people are interested, that's an understudy.
Mercedes, and then we're going to look some of the chat comments. Yes, Mercedes.
I like the question about diffusion, and I was thinking about how to answer. And I think that because the diffusion theory works perfectly during the beginning of the century in South America with the idea of the paradigm of migration as a human right. And it works very well the southern cone, starting from Argentina. And this idea sparse, but you need like a region or a fora to disperse this kind of good practice. Or as Natalie says, you need like a big brother, like the international organizations to put the idea. But the crisis, I mean, the idea of the crisis go against this because you need like politics as usual to disperse this type of idea. During with the Venezuelan, I mean, all countries said, I do my best for me and for my people, and I don't want anyone to say what I need to do. I think that perhaps with time, we will, I mean, I think, for example, IOM is trying to restart the idea of the Mercosur and to use as a place or a space to these kind of things, but not yet.
Thank you. Yes.
I just want to make a very short comment in relation to a comment made by Shibar and Natalie. Actually, I liked one mention by Shibar when he made a reference to the barbershop nationalists or the so-called gastronomic background, like in barbershops, cafes. People often discuss things that are not banal, but very nationalistically empowering. And I wonder if you have done any research, or if you would like to make any research exploring this politics of memory and oblivion and recollection, specifically within the settings. Because actually, this gastronomic background is very historical. It was initiated by Hemingway when he was actually devoted the whole his art to the gastronomical background. All his works are based on conversations in cafes between soldiers wounded by the First World War. And they discuss tremendous things. And also Michael Mann and Michael Diddick speak about barbershops or bars when clients discuss with staffing personnel, nationalistic issues. I wonder if there has been any research on the recent revitalization of politics of oblivion in your countries of research in these nationalistic settings, and to what extent do you think these narratives that are produced within the settings, if you as researchers observe them ethnographically, to what extent would they differ or resonate with narratives produced by informants in more private settings, like on one-on-one interviews? That could also be interesting, like the interplay, the interaction between meta-official discourses and very private discourses.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'd have to dig some more on the politics of memory. To my knowledge, no, but I don't want to say no definitively. What I will say is we have observed this differentiation between the official and private narratives, and that's actually, I think, what is fueling my own desire to do this research, because it's been difficult to get access to state officials to share their impression of how they can change the crisis. And then you have the flip side, which is the migrants and the organizations doing the heavy work and participating in migrants' lived experience. But it would be really interesting as you propose to explore this.
Especially the role maybe of so-called facilitators like bartenders, barbershop keepers, because when there is violent conflict like now, or an influx of migrants, normally these people, they hugely discuss it within their barbershops, especially if the owners are specific ethnic affiliation. So that would be very provocative, just to observe it ethnographically.
Yeah, just to add on, and to play off what you're saying.
Maybe simulate and maybe kind of predict a historic, a specific political event happening. That would be interesting.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting situation. Because yes, as we know, and this is not just only Caribbean, I think in any sort of migration context, these conversations happen. Even here at Tim Hortons, that's a meeting site for immigrants to talk about at a very personal level what's happening. And I'll speak for Trinidad. I started off the presentation by trying to emphasize how deep-seated the mobilities between the two countries are, and especially in the southern part of the island. You can find communities that speak Spanish only, right? Our culture, I was just joking with Henry about what Christmas is like. I know pastels and cake in English, right? But we call meat-filled like patties, I guess, pastels, and that's a central part of our culture, Christmas culture, right? So, like Natalie said, there is a historical amnesia that's happening there. But I like your idea of going into these settings where these people frequent to get I guess a unarresting self.
For example, one thing that comes to my mind, we probably have in Hispanic culture this cultural, religious phenomenon of communion for girls, or like some celebration of 12 years birthday. How is it played out in diaspora, for example?
Well, I can answer. It's very ingrained in some of the Spanish-speaking culture, mostly in the Mexican culture. I don't think it's common in the South America, and it is not common in Central America, which created the issue of homogenizing population of immigrants. I think I'm talking with, I don't remember talking, there are 23 countries. The moment we cross the border, the Rio Grande, we become Latinos without any differentiation. Okay, Anna told me to move along, okay?
Because I'm aware it's 4:10 and I realize many people have other.
Yeah, okay, do you want to quickly comment?
All right, well, thank you so much, Marcela, Mercedes, Natalie, Shiva, great presentations, on the Venezuelan migration thing. That's what you said. Also, Henry, amazing. So anyhow, so we only have a couple of questions on the chat. One of them is by Mohamed Nasser from Wilfrid Laurier University here in Ontario. It's about the global compact for migration and its implications by member states considering the Venezuelan crisis in India. So on the one hand, Mohammed is asking, on the one hand, countries have the right to restrict people's entry into the borders because of sovereignty and also public safety. That everybody understand that. On the other hand, there are signatories to the Global Compact for Migration, which recognizes the right of migration as a human right. So in terms of the global migration governance and your expertise, how do you square that circle? How do you balance that out? So that would be one question. And the other question that we have right now so far, it's from our colleagues at UBC, University of British Columbia, for the learning exchange, is basically in 2022, over 440 Venezuelans have crossed the Darien Gap between Colombia and Panama coming to North America. What is gonna happen there? Like how will it impact society in the United States, in Canada, the economy, politics? How will be the reactions? Do you think will be different than in your case in the global South? Will it be different here in the global North? Will Henry, in the global North, we cry wolf louder and we complain more, and I think there might be also another question by participant that might be writing something down later on.
Mercedes, would you like to?
Yes, I would like to say something, but try to answer the first question about the compact pact on migration, and I think that is working. That I think that really works. That we have to make a timeline. The first answer of especially in Southern America, the initial reaction of government was to do what they wanted by themselves and abandoning the previous commitments. About which commitment? About those commitments that they could not reach because they were very far beyond or their possibility. That was to allow people to enter because migration was a human right. But after this initial response, it was, a very good initiative, the one that was promoted by United Nations to save them all and to put money to resolve this crisis. So, and I think the way of giving solution is by those parameters of the compact, international compact migration.
Maybe just to say there is a very obvious irony, which is what's posed in the question, because Guyana actually chaired the GCM and or co-chaired the GCM, and so it's highlighted that these international norms are important, but again, if the countries don't have it legislated at the national level, that's where we have the gap being created. And so one of the things I've advocated for when writing is the importance of states recognizing that you can't just say something at the global level, but then at the national level do something else. So there needs to be a more happy marriage between these commitments that you make at at a diplomatic level and then at the national level.
Okay, Shiva, and then your
Yeah.
question.
That irony stuck, right, between Guyana. I've always thought that Guyana has positioned itself as being receptive to international sort of, I won't say dictates, but international instruction, I guess. I don't want to be cynical either. But these agreements, not only the GCM, they don't have the teeth that pressures countries.
There's some consequences.
You know, the whole name and shame thing, okay, yeah, Trinidad didn't do this, okay, and what? What is the consequence, right? If you have a powerful piece, a powerful convention, like the 51 agreement and its protocol, you sign on to it, sure, lovely, nice picture opportunity. But once it is not implemented at the domestic level.
Yeah, and you can have a national court saying that even though you signed onto it, it's not valid, and you can deport people who have registered with UNHCR, like that makes no sense.
It doesn't break a law.
Yeah, it doesn't add up.
All right, more questions in the back before Anna asks hers?
No, I passed for mine because I realized we're over time, but
I
there's
thought
one more.
it's a 4:30, we live in a 4:30?
But-
Okay.
No, just a second. There is a person in the chat.
Yeah, so there is a person in the chat, the Rafa doing, it's basically about by the terms of the resources, I guess, you know, the capabilities in terms of education, skills, finance, etc., of the Venezuelan migrants in the region, the Latin American region, the Caribbean region, you know, how does it differ, and also how might compare to the Venezuelans that are left behind. And also very quickly, if you can just say anything about, you know, smugglers, and is there a role of human smugglers in terms of, you know, providing information, facilitating a place to easy access to borders, and so on and so forth.
May I suggest, this is a very large question that
Yeah,
will require
it's
another
huge,
workshop, but I believe everyone who was registered received the papers, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think certainly Martela's papers provides some answers to this question, and perhaps we'd be happy to connect, right, with, Martela's to get some more, because this is, really a very large question.
Thank you very much for illuminating our